Welcome to the Soul Path Sessions podcast with Deborah Mines Pearson and Brenda Littleton. Brenda is an educator and counselor rooted in Jungian and eco-psychology. She helps her clients understand the importance of the mind, body, spirit, and earth relationship for healing. Deborah is a licensed psychotherapist and has been trained in traditional and sacred psychology, exploring from the ground up what makes our human experience meaningful, wholesome, and enlightening. Deborah and Brenda invite you to accompany them on a soul path journey as they explore the possibilities of living a more soulful life as therapists, seekers, and lovers of fate.
So welcome back, Brenda.
Thank you, Deborah.
And we're going to try this again.
Yeah.
We're going to have some fun with a lot of different ideas that we're personally really involved with. Something you said really intrigued me because it's different than the model I was taught as a therapist, which was how to do an intake with a new client. And the traditional model of the genogram or family history model is trauma-based. And we certainly don't want to ignore that. I mean, that's a really important piece of getting to know each other as humans. And as a therapist, it's really important that we don't skip over, like we talked about last time, the dark stuff and try to transcend. But sometimes it gets so wound aware in that process that the client becomes more aware of the wound and not the potentialities of what's gone on before in their family of origin. So I'm going to just let you explain your process.
Thank you. Well, I started doing genograms on intakes in domestic violence clinic, and that was the very beginning of my intake process. And I would sit with someone, and over a period of an hour, we would chart out and see this pattern, multi-generational, from grandparents, even great-grandparents. Some of the women were quite young and knew their great-grandparents. And we could actually see the distortion and the behavior choices as a pattern. And it was so flooring for them. It was the first time that they had ever looked at the culture of their family. And yet, part of why they were in the clinic, why they were in the program, was that they were busting out and they wanted new choices and new behaviors. And so the awareness was so overwhelming that much of their process for a couple of months after that was, as you said, dealing with the awareness of the wound. That has stayed with me for a couple of decades, where I realized way before being a therapist, I was a professor, and I had worked in quantum as far as using quantum to teach personal literacy. And that is involved with narrative and personal story and a lot of Brian Swim's work. And the idea that time continuum is non-locale and it's multidimensional. And that if you can go backward, you can go forward. And going backward meant looking at all aspects. And so when I started my coaching practice, the idea was to really look at what a client brings in as far as resources. And I started to do the genogram, but instead of looking at the wounding pattern, I wanted them to identify the resources, the resilience, where we don't really know. We never had those conversations, mostly in looking at what our great-grandparents went through, what our grandparents went through. Most of us are immigrants. Even if we're native born into the United States, there is a history that's really easily located as to what immigrants had to go through and what year. And I know for myself, I have a long lineage on both sides of my parents of immigration from England, Scotland, and Ireland, and multi-generations, way before 1849. So just working with clients to identify, well, where did they come from? What what transportation did they use to get to the West Coast, let's say, or to the East Coast, and really allow a person to identify, wow, there was a lot of resilience, there was a lot of imagination, there was a lot of belief and hope, as well as working through new situations that was unconfirmed, unpredictable, having to pivot at the last moment and survive, as well as basic care. Like how did they secure food? How did they secure a home? How did they start a community? How did they fit in? So once we can identify those skill sets, we may not believe that we ourselves are using them on a day-to-day basis. But when we come across some conflict, or when we come across a wall that's difficult for us to figure it out, for us to call upon the resources of their ancestors, and it works.
Yeah, I mean, what you were fortunate to be working with in the case of some of these clients you're mentioning is that they knew about their ancestors. Mm-hmm. And I think there's times where people really have an unclear picture, or it's so dysfunctional. And I know that sometimes we have to use active imagination, like helping people to imagine what it might have been like for the people that came before them. It's great when people actually can know these folks and what they went through. I'm finding that a lot of my younger clients don't have a real good idea. I sometimes ask them to storytell. Say to grandma, tell me the story of how that happened, which they're very reluctant to do. I hope it's not a dying art to sit at their knee or next to them and say, what was it like when you were growing up?
Why do you think they're reluctant?
I think, well, a lot of it has to do with electronics. I mean, when people sit together, many times they're referring to things that are going on that are distracting, maybe a TikTok video or a meme, which I'm not against those things, but the older person can just be sitting in the corner, or if they want to join it, they have to share the modern. Mm-hmm. So I think that can be one way to block it. I mean, in my family, it was really, storytelling was a thing. The Irish side and the Swedish side, the Finnish side, and the Northern European. I mean, there was a time where you actually recited poetry, where you told the story of how you got here. And as a little girl, I mean, you really did gather around people that were born in 1893 and heard about people that were born in the 1870s and what they went through and the funny stories, the things they endured. And you're right, like my grandpa George, I mean, he talked about his dad having to go to mining camps and set up bars, and he was just this only child, and the way he brought food in when his dad would be gone, setting up a new camp would be to go down to the where they dump the waste into the lake or the river, and he'd catch fish.
Yeah.
And he was like 8 years old. I think he had a 3rd grade education, but his resourcefulness always stayed with me, and how much fun he had with his dog King and jumping on the back of a wagon as it was leaving town. Just that sense of adventure and delight as a
Tom
gift.
Sawyer or Huck.
Totally.
Huck Finn.
Yeah, and he was a provider when he was 8 years old.
I have a story of me. My relatives brought a house from Ireland around the Horn, and then figured out how to get to the inside of Vancouver Island.
See, that's a showstopper. Like, everybody's going, they brought a house from Ireland.
Yeah, piece by piece, and then they put it together, and they had this furniture, and this one piece, I don't know what happened to it, but I wish I did. It was a long table, and there was a running board at the bottom of the table where you put your feet on, like, so you would have your feet, ideally, I guess, in Ireland, you put your feet on this running board so your feet aren't standing in shit in the bar in the bar or something, the refuge. But anyways, this table was in a very large dining room, and I was in I remember being 3, and I was asleep on this running board, and I remember there was all of the relatives. It's a huge dinner, which was common on Sunday evening, and I fell off the table, and I realized I had been jolted, and what they were doing was sitting around table tapping, and so the table was levitating and table tapping, and
you're gonna have to go deeper into that, because some people are like, table tapping?
Yeah, we're asking a question and calling in energies to answer the question based on the table would actually lift. But this thing was like 20 feet long,
Ooh.
very heavy. And it held, I think there was like 32 people around the table. So those types of stories, those sense
Now,
of,
that's a great story. I mean, I just want to sit and say, how did they actually get that house here?
they took it apart piece by piece.
And they put it on a what?
A boat that they built.
That's so great.
Yeah.
I mean, they built a boat to put their house in to take it to the New World.
Yeah. And I don't know how they ended up knowing to go up the coast of California, up the coast of Oregon, up the coast of Washington, and on the outside of Vancouver Island, and going in the fjord and going into this little area called Port Alberni. I have no idea how they knew that.
Plus the open seas they faced.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a long way to Tipperary. I mean,
Yes,
it's
So this is what generated my, I downloaded this idea. It was like, well, because I was facing some ardent and strenuous moments of my life, as I normally do. And I heard this voice saying, Brenda, think of your great-great-great-grandmother. Yeah. This is nothing. The rain was pouring in my house, the roof that was leaking for the third time after having 3 roofs, and it was still gushing, and thinking, this is nothing. I can get through this. I can face this. I can laugh about this. I do not have to puddle in a corner thinking, oh.
Yeah, the resourcefulness, it was just, you just had to be resourceful. My great-grandmother when her shoes were off, she wore them on the opposite feet.
Why?
You get more use out of them. I mean, she didn't have...
Like changing the tires in the car, rotating the tires.
Right, and she got she had goats, and she was just really practical in that way, but she was the only person to make it out of Finland, as I recall. Her brother took another boat, so she and her brother, it was a family of like 8 children, and when I went back to Finland, which was a marvelous journey of the soul, to trace her roots, all of her siblings and her parents died of influenza. And that was after a great war. So she, as a young woman, got on this boat without a word of English, and Finnish has nothing in common with any language that I know of. And she made it over here, and she lived really, really simply. She was just really kind. She lived close to the earth. I know my mother was greatly influenced by her kindness, and her connection to God was her faith. And that carried through the lineage on my side. Her great faith. I mean, it's like I couldn't tell you a story of her faith as much as I could tell you how it feels, and how much my grandmother drew from it, and how much my mother drew from it. The power of prayer. That quiet candle of prayer got passed down to me.
So you're the current downloadable version of that. And that's how I introduce it to clients. It's like, what current downloadable program are you carrying? What can you share?
I love that. And so if someone doesn't have a relative, let's say they came from 2 generations of dysfunctional, addictive violence, which is sadly true, and they have a shining quality, I many times ask them, or suggest to them, there's someone in your lineage who's passed this to you. Can you imagine them? And believe it or not, they come through with somebody. Just if they sit there long enough, they come through, and it doesn't necessarily have to be through their family. They might bring in an entity from another life.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. I might say something like, I've always felt like a native person of the soil, and I hear that, I feel that when I'm out in nature. They don't necessarily draw from this family. They have a larger collective.
So you're including the possibility of animism. That's a great foundation for me as well. That everything has spirit, everything is soul, and being in an animistic state, that liminal space that can lead us into active imagination, is a great guide. Being able to see images, to step into that frequency of activity that transcends generations, whatever that activity is, that you can kind of step into that flow and allow the information to come through.
And relate, which is relationship.
Yeah.
Be
Again,
in relationship
it's quantum. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, so the sky's the limit to our, and many people tell me it might not have been a person, but it was my dog. My dog carried a kindness that permeated me, with a loyalty that was there for me. I didn't have a mother or a father, but I had a soul come through, and an animal that kept me company. And a beautiful story to go with that dog's faithfulness, like my grandfather did with King. King was always there when his father would leave them stranded. King was there.
One way that when I'm sitting with someone who really can't go beyond their parents, like for whatever reason, I'll ask them to imagine a place of sovereignty, their own sovereignty, and to go back and describe the setting. And inevitably, there is this connection with nature. You're sitting outside in the stars, maybe going camping, being a young child. There's some connection, either picking a flower or having a moment under a tree or along the ocean, let's say, something. And ask them to revisit and to remember the sense of sovereignty, the sense of personal empowerment, the sense of peace, and then bring that forward. And even just tracking back and then bringing it forward and then having it live, like be here in the room, is a way to open those doors of remembering some prior ancestral work.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, time isn't really the thing. It's in the now moment that we connect, which I feel a poem coming on. It's special music. Good.
Please.
The poem that came to me was one by Wendell Berry. A lot of people love this poem. It's one of my favorites. And I think it really is a good poem for now, when so much is going on in the world that is difficult. As we speak, the Ukrainian people are going through tremendous pain, and we're all feeling for them and with them. Our own family histories. Many of us are here because of war, with our ancestors coming because of war, driving them out of their world. So the poem is The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. And for a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. Yeah. There's a reason I think we call this Mother Earth.
Could you repeat the last couple lines, please?
Yes, of course. I think the part that brings tears in my eyes. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free.
Those moments of feeling free are so important in our own our own personal space.
Well, I think it's this. We were both graced with the peace that came from the story that came from our ancestors, which we were very fortunate that they told the stories, that they could tell them. That I would sit wrapped at my grandmother's feet while she talked about growing up in Mexico, and her father was a silver miner who his body is buried somewhere in the desert, and just Pancho Villa coming into town and her having to hide from the guns ablazing, and she was this young psychic young woman that tapped into so many things. And so we have that sense of it. And so I would go into a lull. My grandmother's stories, I mean, right now I had to stop myself, just edit, because I could probably speak. I listen so much that their stories captivate me. And so that's the lull of the story, where you don't even really aren't doing anything other than being fed in the very cells of your body and experience from the past that teaches so much just in the telling, but you're not actively trying to learn it. And then for those people that don't have that connection, the idea that they grew up with the forest, or they grew up in the desert, especially we're in the desert here, they grew up at the sea, and there's a sense of the stories that the sea would tell, the stories of the quietness or the sound. So we have both, okay, but we can draw from both of them. The power in knowing that, okay, I'm going to, a little brag alert, but my great grandfather was the strongest man in the world.
Really?
Yeah. Carl Mackey was a champion rock driller in the world. That meant they used to take a railroad spike, and a man would hold, he would hold on to this big rock, and there would be and he held on to the spike that was on the top of the rock. And then my great grandfather took this big mallet-y thing and just slammed it down. He's like 6'4" and he's a huge guy, and it went into the rock further than anyone else in the world. And in those days, because mining was such a big deal, he was the strongest man in the world. And there's
opening it
of,
up. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, as an example of playing with our skill set in genogram and all of our good things, all of our strengths, how are you embodying that molecular activity of your grandfather?
I'll tell you what my kids would say. She's a little nutty. So one of the things that I know I can do,
like, what are you opening up?
I open up like that idea of endurance, incredible endurance in difficulty. First of all, he was an immigrant. He did brave things. He pulled a railroad car down the track. So when I think of like my luggage being heavy or something, I think of Carl Mackey. Yeah. We actually call him Carl fucking Mackey. That's what I jump in.
Sounds like a dancer.
I know. Well, Mackey is Finnish, and I think it's Irish too. But I can jump in ice cold water and swim, and I think of Carl Mackey.
Okay.
Because I think if Carl can do it,
you can do it too.
I can do it too.
Yeah.
And our kids, actually, when they say something's difficult, they just say, well, if Carl fucking Mackey could do it, I could do it too.
And that becomes the lineage. That becomes part of our legacy.
Yeah.
And if that's what we can bring for our future generations, even just owning it in this moment, in the present, I think that is living our true selves, our true molecules.
I think it is. I think it's an inspiring story. I have an extended family of children that I adore, and I'm their mother, spirit mother, whatever it is. And they've actually said, I want to feel Carl fucking Mackey for myself. So you don't have to, it's just that energy's so strong. They've actually lived in the story enough to relate that it's even possible, like in the Olympics where people do like quadruple luxes or whatever. I mean, somebody did it before.
Throwing,
yeah, they just know that you can, once something's been done, you can do it.
Yeah.
And that's what a story's about. I could endure it. I could exceed or succeed.
Profit from it. Yeah.
I could dig in deep.
Yeah.
So
and not be wiped out by it.
And not be wiped out.
And I think that's one of the goals in this modality is resourcing and knowing that it sucks and we can get through it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that brings up some sadness too, because, my grandparents were very clear that there was poverty in some ways. There was just that they had to endure that, but they didn't stay in a victim place with it. There was loneliness, there was some isolation, they generally put a humorous turn on it. Like when my grandfather talked about his cousin Bessie falling out a window in Chicago and landing on the awning and being all right. But I mean, there wasn't safety for the children. There wasn't sometimes enough food to eat, but they'd find resourceful ways to get it.
Yeah.
They'd wait for the iceman to come and they'd beg for ice, these kinds of things.
Yeah, I as you're speaking, I'm remembering family stories of similar but different. Yeah, the ideas.
And sometimes I see when I'm working with people who come from a long line of addiction, I look at addiction as really a hunger for spirit, a hunger for a connection, a feeling of safety, or to numb out. And so when I'm working with someone who's wanting to face the world without that shield, to reframe it as you are the one who will do it for your family.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm pretty influenced by the work of Gabor Mate, and the addictions are all, it doesn't matter what, it doesn't have to be chemical, biochemical, it can be behavioral, but the idea of a real longing for love, and in resolving that biochemical imbalance, working toward balancing ego and soul with the idea of personal resources, resilience, and love is it. Yeah. It's
and he went through the Hungarian, he was in World War II.
Yeah.
He was an infant in Hungary.
Given up for, his mother gave him away to save him. They reconnected, of course, but still that was a real wounding moment of being given away, not having mom. But that's a whole other world.
Well, we're kind of revisiting it now as we see images of war, of this revisitation of that. And I think it's the stories that do keep us strong. And when you're bringing up Gabor Mate, I'm thinking of another person with Hungarian roots, which is our favorite Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who wrote Women Who Run with Wolves. And her father's side, I think, came from Hungary. Her mother's side from Mexico. Would that be correct?
I believe so.
And poem alert. I feel a poem coming on. This is going to happen. It's like, ooh, special music. But it kind of ties into a poem it just happened today. These things happen as how soul works. And it has to do with what we're talking about. She talked about the tremendous struggle of genocide in her family, and the people that survived came on the trains, and they had just seen the death of children and young men and whole families, and the ones who survived went on to plant trees and to cook and rebuild and tell stories. And so there's this prayer that she shares at the end of one of my very favorite books, which is called The Faithful Gardener. So if, with your permission,
please.
Okay, I'm having a moment here. I'm verklempt. Okay. A prayer. Refuse to fall down, and if you cannot refuse to fall down, refuse to stay down. If you cannot refuse to stay down, lift your heart toward heaven, and like a hungry beggar, ask that it be filled. You may be pushed down. You may be kept from rising, but no one can keep you from lifting your heart toward heaven, only you. It is in the middle of misery that so much becomes clear. The one who says nothing good came of this is not yet listening.
And that concludes this week's episode of the Soul Path Sessions podcast with Deborah Mines Pearson and Brenda Littleton. If you'd like to hear more about living a more soulful life, please subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast app, and be sure to check out the show notes and links below. For more information from Deborah, visit soulpathsessions.com, and for Brenda, brendalittleton.com. Thank you for listening, and remember to follow your soul. It knows the way.